What's the creepiest display of intelligence you've ever witnessed in real life? I met two people with eidetic memory, and both of them had the same eerie habit. Whenever you asked something, they'd tilt their head and look up like they were opening a drawer in their brain. The first guy did it constantly. You'd mention a party from years ago, and he'd repeat what you said back then, word for word, including the awkward joke you thought nobody noticed. He remembered the exact sentence, the pause before it, and who laughed first. It wasn't bragging either. He spoke calmly, like reading a document. The second person was the same way, only quieter. They'd stare upward for a second, then answer with perfect detail. After a while, talking to them felt strange, like I was being recorded. Normal people forget. These two stored everything, and it made every conversation feel heavier. Next story, I worked with an Australian guy during OIF in 2006, and he had a party trick that never stopped shocking people. You could shout any date, day, month, and year, and he'd instantly tell you the day of the week. No phone, no watch, no, let me think, just Wednesday, like he'd been there. At first, we assumed it was rehearsed, so we tested him with random birthdays, weird years, and dates from before he was born. We'd pull up calendars afterward, and he was always right. The creepiest part wasn't just the accuracy, it was how effortless it looked. He didn't squint or calculate on his fingers. He'd hear the date and answer with confidence, like the day was printed beside it in his head. After a while, it stopped feeling like a trick and started feeling like something unnatural. Next story. I knew a kid with an intellectual disability who was nonverbal and needed one-on-one help every day. Most of the time, he seemed distant, like he was in his own world and basic tasks were a struggle. But one afternoon, someone gave him a huge jigsaw puzzle, expecting him to lose interest. Instead, he flipped every piece over so the blank cardboard side faced up. No picture, no reference. Then he started building it anyway. His hands moved fast and sure, like he could feel which shapes belonged together without seeing anything. Within minutes, the edges were forming. Soon after, the whole puzzle was nearly complete. The staff just stared. It wasn't luck. It was pure pattern recognition, stronger than anything I'd seen in normal kids. It made me realize intelligence can hide behind silence. Next story. We were studying when a girl suddenly froze, staring at a page in a medical anatomy textbook. She pointed at a photo of a young man and said she'd seen him before. Everyone laughed, assuming she was joking, but she insisted it was real and that she recognized him from childhood. Later she went home, dug through old boxes, and came back with her third-grade math workbook. She opened it to a random page, and there he was again. Same face, same smile, just a different pose. It turned out he was a stock photo model used in multiple textbooks, but the creepy part was that she recognized him instantly after so many years. We all realized she hadn't just remembered the image, she remembered the feeling of seeing it as a kid. Watching her prove it felt like a glitch in reality, like the same person had been following her through different stages of life. Next story. My husband grew up in a rough area and eventually ended up in prison. Inside, he met a man who could read people so well it felt like mind reading. The guy wasn't loud or violent. He was polite, patient, and almost friendly. But within minutes of meeting someone, he knew exactly what they wanted, what they feared, and what they would trade to feel safe. He'd say the right words at the right moment, and people would hand over favors, information, or loyalty without realizing they'd been steered. My husband said it was like watching a professional gambler spot every tell at a poker table. The scariest part was how calm he stayed. He never rushed, never pushed. He simply played people and let them walk into their own choices. In a place built on survival, that kind of intelligence felt dangerous. Next story. A friend introduced me to Miriam at a party, calling her the human calculator. She was a math major and treated numbers like casual conversation. Someone decided to test her and asked her to multiply two huge numbers, the kind people usually punch into a calculator. Miriam didn't grab a pen. She didn't even pause long enough to look uncertain. She stared ahead for a second, then said the answer out loud like she was reading it off a screen. Everyone laughed nervously and checked on their phones. She was correct. The room went quiet in that weird way where everyone suddenly feels smaller. People tried again with different numbers, harder numbers, and she kept nailing them. It wasn't just speed, it was the confidence. She didn't perform for attention. She looked mildly bored, like this was normal and we were the slow ones. That's what made it unsettling. Next story. My grandmother had a habit that used to creep me out when I was a kid. Before she answered any question, she'd look up and go quiet, like she was watching something only she could see. It wasn't a dramatic pause, just a small natural shift, eyes lifted, face blank for a second. Then she'd answer perfectly, with the exact words you needed. If I asked about homework, she'd explain it clearly. If my mom asked about a recipe, she'd list every step without checking anything. Even random questions like, "What was that neighbor's dog's name?" came back instantly. It felt like she had a search bar inside her head. I used to stare at her eyes, waiting for the moment she found the answer. As I got older, I realized it was just memory and focus, but as a child, it felt supernatural. Next story. A friend of mine spoke Korean, so one day I asked him to translate a note I'd received that I thought was Korean. He glanced at it, frowned, and said, "This isn't Korean, it's Japanese." I assumed he was guessing, but then he started speaking Japanese fluently, like he'd switched channels in his head. I got embarrassed and told him it was fine if he didn't actually know Korean. He looked genuinely confused and said he did know Korean. He just also knew Japanese, and this note clearly wasn't Korean. Then, like it was nothing, he explained the difference in characters and pronunciation. He wasn't trying to show off. That's what made it stranger. He acted as if speaking multiple languages was as normal as switching between texting and talking. I walked away realizing I had underestimated him completely, and it made my brain itch. Next story. I grew up with a guy who could see systems the way other people see colors. He couldn't always explain the math behind it, but he could predict outcomes with unsettling accuracy. In group projects, he'd quietly say which person would bail, who would take control, and how the teacher would react, and he was almost always right. In arguments, he'd watch for a minute and then tell you how it would end, like he'd seen the last page already. He wasn't psychic, he just understood patterns in people. He noticed who wanted attention, who wanted control, and who was desperate to be liked. Being around him felt like playing a game where he already knew the rules you didn't. Sometimes he'd warn you and you'd ignore him. Then the exact thing he predicted would happen, and you'd feel cold inside. The creepiest part was how calm he stayed, even when he was right. Next story. It wasn't creepy at first, but I noticed something different about a coworker. He remembered every face he'd ever seen. Not kind of, remembered. Perfectly. If someone walked into our office, he'd casually say, "I met him at a conference in 2015, and then list the booth number, the city, and what the guy talked about. He'd recall people from restaurants, airports, even brief encounters in passing. The worst part was how detailed it got. Clothing, exact phrases, small habits like how someone held their coffee cup. It made normal social life feel like surveillance, as if nothing ever disappeared. Being around him changed how I acted in public. I realized that for him, every stranger was potentially a file he could open. He wasn't creepy as a person, but his memory was. It made me wonder how much of my life I'd forgotten, and how much he would never forget. Next story. In my town, there was a guy who could tell the time down to the minute without checking anything. He'd be mid-conversation, stop, and say, "It's 2:17, like a thought had arrived. Someone would check a phone, and it would be exactly 2:17. At first, it seemed like luck, but it kept happening. Different locations, different days, no clocks in sight, no obvious cues. We started testing him the way people test a magic trick, waiting random lengths of time and asking again. He still nailed it. What made it unsettling was how relaxed he stayed. He didn't act like he was concentrating. He'd just answer, then continue talking. Eventually, I realized he must have had some internal rhythm so accurate it worked like a stopwatch. But even knowing that, it was eerie watching someone live with a clock in their head that never drifted. Next story. A new kid moved from Russia to our school, and teachers quickly realized he was on another level. In geography class, the teacher started with easy questions, pointing at a world map and naming countries. The kid knew all of them instantly. Then the teacher tried capitals. Still perfect. So the teacher got stubborn and started naming random cities and regions, hoping to finally stump him. The kid didn't even blink. He answered smoothly, corrected pronunciations, and sometimes added extra facts like population or nearby rivers. The class went silent because it wasn't normal studying hard knowledge. It felt like he had downloaded an atlas into his brain. The teacher's face changed from confident to unsettled, like he was realizing he couldn't control the room anymore. Watching an adult lose that battle in real time was strange. The kid wasn't smug either. He looked bored, like this was obvious. Next story. I once watched a kid solve a complicated math problem without writing a single thing down. The teacher put a long equation on the board, the kind that usually fills an entire page of work. Everyone else reached for paper, but this kid just stared at the numbers. No whispering, no finger counting, no scratching notes in the margin. He stood there completely still, eyes locked on the board like he was watching a movie. After maybe 10 seconds, he quietly said the answer. The teacher blinked, asked him to explain, and the kid calmly walked through the steps out loud. Perfect logic, no gaps. It wasn't memorized. He genuinely processed it in his head faster than we could even begin. The room felt colder after that, like we had all witnessed the same species operating at a different speed. He didn't look proud, which made it worse. It was just normal for him. Next story. My boyfriend has a terrifying memory for faces. He doesn't forget them, even if he saw someone for 2 seconds years ago. The first time I noticed, we were walking through a busy store and he casually said, "That's the guy from the gas station in 2018. I laughed, but he described the exact station and what the man bought. Later, it turned out he was right. It kept happening in airports, restaurants, and random crowds. He'd spot someone and connect them to a tiny moment from the past, like his brain had tagged the memory permanently. The unsettling part is how effortless it is. He doesn't stare or concentrate. He just knows. Sometimes he'll remember a face before he remembers a name, and it frustrates him the way a glitch frustrates a computer. Public places feel different with him, like everyone is traceable. When he recognizes someone and they don't recognize him, it feels like he has secret access to a memory database." Next story. My sister got perfect grades through elementary school. Every report card was straight 100s. I kept warning her that the next year would be harder, that eventually something would challenge her. She just smiled and kept going. Middle school stayed flawless. High school stayed flawless. She became valedictorian, and by then everyone treated her like a machine that never missed. Then the SAT happened, 2330 out of 2400. Every Ivy accepted her, and she calmly chose Princeton like it was the obvious option. The creepiest part wasn't the talent. It was the lack of struggle. Nothing ever seemed to cost her effort. She didn't pull all-nighters or panic before exams. She just showed up and won. Watching someone climb without slipping makes you wonder what normal even means and where the ceiling is for a person like that. Next story. When I was a teenager, I babysat a special needs group after school. One boy barely spoke, avoided eye contact, and usually sat quietly tapping his fingers. Most days he seemed completely disconnected. Then someone brought in a keyboard for fun. A staff member played a short melody once, just to see what would happen. The boy stood up, walked over, and played it back perfectly. Not close, exact. Same notes, same rhythm, same tiny pauses. Everyone froze like we'd just seen a magic trick. He didn't smile or look proud, he just did it, then went back to his chair. People tried again with a longer tune, and he repeated that too. It was haunting, realizing so much was happening in his mind that the rest of us couldn't access. In that moment, it felt like he wasn't limited at all. He was just wired differently. Next story. Apparently, the only way my partner can visualize anything is through sound. He can't form pictures in his head at all. No faces, no landscapes, no mental images. When I asked him to imagine a beach, he didn't see waves. Instead, he described it in audio, the hiss of water, distant voices, seagulls, wind flapping a towel, footsteps in sand. He can build entire scenes like that, layering sound cues to measure distance and space. He told me he navigates memories the same way. He doesn't replay visuals, he replays the atmosphere. At first, it sounded impossible, like he was joking, but he explained it so clearly that it made me uncomfortable. It showed me how different a human mind can be while still functioning perfectly. The strangest part is that he thought everyone else did it his way until he was older. For him, the world inside his head is dark but never silent. Next story. I grew up with a guy who had an unreal lab brain. While the rest of us played games, he built experiments at home for fun. He'd read manuals, mix chemicals, and talk about reactions like they were sports stats. In class, teachers would explain something once, and he'd instantly understand it, then predict what would happen if you changed one variable. He could describe complex reactions without notes and spot mistakes in other people's work in seconds. The weird part was how calm he stayed, like none of it was difficult. People weren't impressed so much as uneasy, because it felt like he was handling knowledge that could be dangerous in the wrong hands. Once, a teacher joked that he'd end up in a research lab or in trouble, and nobody laughed. It wasn't fear of him as a person, it was fear of what his brain could do if he ever wanted to. Next story. I once saw someone solve a social conflict without raising their voice. A group was arguing, emotions high, everyone interrupting, and it looked like it was about to explode. This person didn't threaten anyone or try to dominate. They listened and started asking simple questions. What do you actually want? What are you afraid will happen? What would be enough to feel respected? Each question forced people to answer honestly instead of performing. Within minutes, the room got quieter. People started agreeing to compromises they swore were impossible 5 minutes earlier. When it was over, everyone acted like it had been their idea. Watching it felt like seeing someone pick a lock with a smile. Gentle, precise, and terrifyingly effective. Nobody noticed they'd been guided until it was too late. I still think about how easily tension can be hacked when someone understands human psychology better than we understand ourselves. Next story. I knew someone who could replay conversations verbatim, not the general meaning, exact words, tone, and order. If you said something in frustration months ago, they could quote it back like they'd pressed play on a recording. At first, it seemed impressive, even useful for settling misunderstandings. Then it became unsettling. During arguments, you couldn't claim you didn't say that because they would repeat your sentence perfectly, including the sarcastic emphasis. Even harmless chats weren't safe from being stored. It made everyone cautious, like speaking around a microphone you couldn't see. The worst part was the confidence it gave them. They never doubted their memory, and that meant you were always the one second-guessing yourself. After a while, people avoided venting around them because one emotional sentence could be saved forever and used later like evidence. Next story. I lived in a small mountain town where all mail went through P.O. boxes, endless rows of identical metal doors. I moved away for 13 years and assumed I was forgotten. When I came back, I walked into the post office, filled out the paperwork, and handed it to the clerk. She glanced at my name, looked up, and said my old box number instantly. I laughed because I thought she was guessing, but she repeated it like a fact. There were over 10,000 boxes in that building, and she remembered mine like it was pinned to her brain. It wasn't just recognition, it was precision. That moment made me realize some people carry details the rest of us don't even notice. I left the post office feeling strangely exposed, like my history was still sitting on a shelf in someone else's head, untouched by time. Next story. In Colorado, a high school cross-country runner went missing on his usual route and was later found killed by a mountain lion. What terrified people wasn't only the attack, it was the pattern. Investigators believed the lion had been tracking his training loops repeatedly, learning his routine like a hunter studying prey. It didn't strike the first time it saw him. It waited until he'd done enough laps to be tired and slow, then chose the moment. The idea that an animal could recognize a schedule, follow it day after day, and pick the weakest point in it made the whole story feel colder. It wasn't random violence. It felt calculated. And that's what stuck with me. After hearing about it, I started thinking differently about routines, how safety can turn into predictability. People in the area said they changed their routes, ran in groups, and stopped wearing headphones because the woods suddenly felt like something was watching and learning. Next story. I was on a SAR man-tracking training retreat in northern New Mexico for about 2 weeks. The instructor noticed everything: footprints, broken twigs, signs most people miss. One morning, he pulled me aside and told me something that made my stomach drop. Every day, they'd found mountain lion tracks shadowing the group's route, but the pattern wasn't random. The lion was tracking me specifically. The instructor said it circled where I walked and followed my line more closely than anyone else's. After that, he insisted I stay paired up at all times, even for short walks, and he kept scanning the tree line like he expected to see eyes. He even suggested wearing a hat with big eyes printed on the back as a deterrent. Knowing a predator had singled me out, not the group, not the loudest person, felt terrifying. It wasn't aggression, it was attention. Next story. I met a couple from Seattle while traveling in England, and the conversation over breakfast turned unexpectedly dark. They casually mentioned that the person who held their job before them had been killed by a mountain lion while biking near Seattle. They didn't say it dramatically, just like it was a strange fact from home. Then they looked at us and asked, completely serious, what dangerous wild animals lived in the forests where we were from. We mentioned the usual things, and they nodded like they were taking notes. What made it weird was the calmness. They had this story of sudden death, and it didn't slow them down at all. Right after that, they talked about their hiking plans like nothing had happened. It felt like watching people normalize danger in real time. Later, I kept thinking about how our brains treat risk differently. Some people hear mountain lion and see a warning. Others hear it and just add it to the background noise of life. Next story. I was with someone who could identify car models instantly, year, trim, sometimes even engine, just from tiny details. We'd walk through a parking lot and they'd glance at a taillight and say, 2012 Civic, EX trim, then keep moving. On the highway, it got even stranger. They'd scan traffic and casually list cars like they were reading labels. 2008 Camry, 2017 with the upgraded package. That truck's a 2004. When I challenged them, they'd point out small clues, badge placement, headlight shape, the curve of a fender. I started checking online afterward, and they were always right. The more I watched them, the more I realized cars have faces, too, just like people. Design language, tiny differences, little signatures hidden in plain sight. It made me feel like I'd been half-blind my whole life, walking past patterns that were everywhere, while they saw the world in perfect detail. Next story, I knew a person who could walk into a room and immediately map the social structure. Within minutes, they could tell who disliked each other, who was nervous, who was lying, and who was trying too hard to fit in. At first, I thought it was just strong intuition. Then they started predicting what would happen next. They'd whisper, "That guy is about to snap," or "She's going to leave early." And it would happen exactly that way. They noticed micro-reactions, tiny pauses, forced smiles, who looked at who when someone spoke. It was like they could see invisible strings pulling everyone around. Being near them made me uncomfortable, because I realized they could probably read me just as easily. Once they told me I was trying to act relaxed when I wasn't, and they were right. It wasn't magic. It was observation turned into a weapon. The scariest part was that they didn't even seem to try. Next story. A friend's brother was a linguist, an Englishman who could switch accents and languages so naturally it sounded like different people were speaking. He wasn't doing it to show off either. He'd greet someone in one accent, turn to someone else and shift into another, and it flowed so smoothly you barely noticed the change. The strangest part was how quickly he mirrored people. He'd hear one sentence from you and match your rhythm, your pronunciation, your little speech habits, without mocking. It was like his brain automatically tuned itself to whoever he was facing. Listening to him felt unsettling because it made me realize how much identity is wrapped up in voice. For him, voice was just a tool. When he spoke your accent back to you perfectly, it felt like looking into an audio mirror. I couldn't tell if it was comforting or invasive. Next story. I saw someone get stuck on a problem, spend the whole evening thinking about it, and go to sleep frustrated. The next morning, they woke up and explained the full solution like it had been handed to them overnight. Not just the final answer. Every step, clean logic, no gaps. They described it as their brain working in the background while they slept, like a computer finishing a task when you're not watching. What made it creepy was how detached they sounded, like the solution didn't come from them. They said they'd fallen asleep still confused, and then woke up knowing exactly what to do. I've had small moments like that, but this was extreme. It was like their subconscious was smarter than their conscious mind. Watching it happen reminded me that some of our best thinking happens in a place we can't access on demand. And that's unsettling because it means the smartest part of us might not be the part we control. Next story. I met someone with an insane memory for small details. Names, dates, exact events. They didn't try to remember, it just happened automatically. You could mention a coworker once, and months later they'd ask how that person's interview went, using the exact date you told them. They remembered where conversations happened, what you were holding, and the exact phrasing you used. It wasn't hostile, but it made me hyper-aware of what I shared. Around them, every casual comment felt permanent, like it was being archived. They'd bring up tiny facts I forgot I'd ever said, and it felt like being quietly documented. The strangest part was how normal it was for them. They didn't see it as special. They assumed everyone stored life with that much detail. After spending time with them, I started wondering how much they had saved about me that I didn't even remember giving them. Next story. A mountain lion jumped onto a catwalk at a zoo when my kids were little, and the moment is burned into my memory. It wasn't frantic or chaotic like you'd expect from a startled animal. It moved with purpose. It paced slowly, head low, eyes locked on my children the way a predator locks onto prey. There was no dramatic roaring, just calm, focused stalking. People screamed, staff shouted, and cameras flashed, but the lion barely reacted. It felt like it was measuring distance and timing, deciding what was possible. That intelligence is what scared me most. It wasn't rage, it wasn't confusion, it was attention. For a few seconds, the barrier between safe zoo outing and nature felt paper thin. The animal's calm made everything worse because it didn't look like a creature out of control. It looked like a creature doing math. That kind of intelligence isn't comforting, it's terrifying.